Welcome to a special edition of No Free Lunch, where we will be talking about the budget and taking a deeper look at the 2026 budget presented last week in Cape Town by the Finance Minister and the real impact on South African economy, business, and the overburdened taxpayers who've had very little return on the massive investment they've made in the country over the past 3 decades. And with me today to unpack all of this is the CEO of Future Forex, Harry Scherzer. Welcome to No Free Lunch, Harry.
Greg, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to chatting about this.
Yeah, and it's been an interesting path in terms of where we were last year, in terms of the budget and the disaster of the budget, with the government trying to push through an astounding 21 billion in extra taxes through the back door, so to speak, and then getting backlash. And this year the budget gone much smoother and generally been accepted as a more optimistic budget. Take us through your view and overall view of the budget, and then we can get into more detail further on.
Yeah, Greg, absolutely. So as you mentioned, last year we had a bit of a disaster with the ANC pushing for a 1% increase in VAT from 14 to 15%, which, as you say, comes to an astounding figure in nominal terms. Whereas the DA said, absolutely not. We don't have to do that. We don't have to increase taxes. There are other ways of making this work. And that caused a lot of division and a weakening of the rand. And so coming from there to this year, which I would argue was a very uneventful, quite a boring budget speech, I'd argue that's a really, really good thing. I mean, you can't do much better than going from extremely poor outlook to a somewhat neutral outlook. So overall, very little happened. There were a few surprises, the main one being that the SDA, which is the single discretionary allowance for money being taken out of the country, moved from 1 million rand to 2 million rand, which effectively means that you can now send 2 million rand, up to 2 million rand out of the country without getting any form of approvals. Previously, that was 1 million rand. But apart from that, there were no real surprises. And as a result, the rand traded in a pretty stable 5-cent margin from 15.83 to 15.88 while the budget speech took place, which is very, very stable for a key announcement.
And apart from the stability in the budget, I think we've also seen things like the tax brackets being adjusted slightly, although take into account, I suppose, that there was 2 years of zero inflationary adjustment on the tax brackets. This year's had to happen, but it still leaves people in a bit of a hole compared to where inflation has been over the last 3 years, for instance. And a little bit of scope of relief for small businesses, especially businesses starting out with the VAT limit margin being increased. I think it was to 2.5 million from 1 million, somewhere around there. But it does mean that for small business starting out, that onerous requirement of VAT reporting is done away with to a certain extent. How do you see that? Do you see that this is a budget that has helped people, or is it simply a budget that is getting back on track?
Yeah, Greg, unfortunately, it's the latter. So if we look at the tax brackets as an example, the tax bracket increased by 3.4%, which pretty much is pretty similar to this year's worth of inflation. So really, it's kind of an increase for inflation. But as you mentioned, they didn't increase it last year. So really, they're not even back on track. If anything, we're paying more taxes in real terms than we were previously. So yeah, I wouldn't say that was a particularly astounding announcement. If anything, it just kept up for the prior year. And the same is true with all the other metrics you spoke of. Nothing's particularly helpful, but nothing is being ignored on the flip side. So there's a situation where they're keeping up with what they need to. And as I mentioned, that's why it was a stable budget speech, a non-eventful budget speech, bit of a boring budget speech. But like I said, I'm delighted with boring on this occasion.
Sometimes boring is better, isn't it? Let's talk a bit about the improved scope of savings for people. Now, there has been some adjustment that will be welcomed by, I think, a fair amount of people, particularly those who are heading for retirement and so on. The limit on tax-free savings has increased fairly substantially from, I think it was 35,000 to 45,000 or around there. And then, of course, there's additional pension contributions and limits that have been adjusted that will also help people. Again, though, it's almost difficult to comment on this, because after the government having taken or allowed people to take 30% of their pensions out of their pension fund over the last couple of years, which actually helped keep the GDP growth rate where it was, which wasn't great. Now you're saying, okay, well, now we're allowing you to save more. Maybe it's, take with one hand and give with the other. But how do you see that in terms of people wanting to save?
Yeah, so it's a real balancing act, as you mentioned, Greg. You need to increase the GDP. That's an important metric for the country. But you also need to increase savings so that there's less burden on the government and people don't go poor in their old age. And as you say, when you decrease the one, it increases the other. So there's a real balancing act here. And they favored saving on this occasion. So they basically favored the idea of, let's increase savings. As you said, it went from 36,000 to 46,000 Rand, the tax-free annual limit, which basically means they're encouraging a bit more saving for people. And the reason they've been able to do that is that they are projecting higher GDP growth rates. The aim is to be at 2% growth rate by 2028. For context, we're currently at 1.6% growth rate. And so it leaves them a little bit of wiggle room to say, right, if we're growing at the rate we are, we can encourage a bit more saving to help our citizens in their old age. But as you say, it's a bit of take with one hand, give with the other, because by increasing savings, you decrease GDP. But we've luckily got a slightly higher lever to decrease our GDP because our GDP is on track. What it really comes down to is trying to get our GDP on track through real things like Eskom, Prasa, Transnet being out of under control, basically all the infrastructure projects. And if you can get that right, you've got more money to play with to increase savings and to better the lives of South Africans. So overall, a pretty good budget speech, not an astoundingly good one, but a pretty good budget speech. But as I said, mainly a budget speech which was completely as expected.
Last week, I attended a post-budget panel discussion where one of the panelists described our current government as one that has employed investment bankers as opposed to employing development bankers. And that is an ongoing theme, isn't it? Because unless we start generating more GDP growth, so when you talk about 2% by 2028, we're talking about an inflation rate of over 3% currently. And so we still, there's still a deficit. And unless the government starts investing in things, you spoke about Eskom, we spoke about these, but those big SOEs have got massive debt to deal with. Apart from the government debt's sitting now almost at 80%. If you add the debt that the SOEs have got, that goes way beyond 80%, closer to 90%. And that's a massive amount of debt to actually have to pay off. How does the government fix that without growing the economy at a faster rate than 2%?
Well, it's a great question, Greg, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one to answer. I mean, the first thing is that there are further talks around the private sector getting involved, which I think would be fantastic. Basically, the public sector and the government have almost proved over the last 3 decades that they aren't able to sustainably run these SOEs, and they've failed en masse. And so having private companies involved, I would welcome. And I think the market as a whole would welcome. And there was more talk of that. So that's the first thing I'd say, which is definitely optimistic and positive as far as I'm concerned. And then the other thing is just to mention, you mentioned how there's almost 80%, I think it's 78.9%, the debt to GDP ratio. And SOEs increase that to, as you say, closer to 90%. The one piece of good news there, which I will just mention, is that it actually stabilized for the first time in 17 years. Every prior year, it's actually got worse and worse and worse. And it stabilized this year. And the aim is that we should actually be at an inflection point where it should start decreasing from now on. So there is more going on, and I think the GNU is a big part of this. The government is being a little bit more responsible with their spend and being a bit more responsible with their infrastructure project development, which will allow for our debt to GDP ratio to decrease, which is extremely well needed. So I do suspect that, along with the strengthening of the rand, along with us being off the grey list and off the junk status of certain rating agencies, I think all of that leads to basically an ability to improve the country as a whole, and the way to basically increase our GDP to hopefully above inflation.
Yeah, you speak about infrastructure expenditure, and that's certainly something that has to be accelerated. And the issue on that is obviously that there was an announcement of, I can't remember the exact figure right now, but there was an improvement in terms of the infrastructure spend that was going to be allocated in the budget. The big problem about all of those things is lack of accountability. And
Mm.
despite you can spend more money and just get no results from it. And that's generally been the problem in the country. And maybe it's time that a bit of money should be spent on creating an independent body that actually holds state departments accountable, that should be completely separate from government, should not have any influence from government, almost like an external auditor. The government auditor general himself has been exasperated with the lack of accountability. Do you think that there's scope for that sort of institution in our economy?
Yeah, Greg, I mean, the figure you were alluding to is over 1 trillion rand has been put into public infrastructure. And as you say, I don't want to think how much of that is misallocated or not allocated at all due to corruption and other reasons. So like you said, I mean, I would absolutely welcome some independent, even an independent auditor coming in, one of the big guys like EY or Deloitte coming in and overseeing how that money is being spent. Because at present, as you say, the amount of money we hear being spent on this stuff and the results aren't commensurate.
Yes.
Or haven't been in the past at very least. And so it's my hope and my suspicion that there will be more accountability with the GNU. So now suddenly at least two parties need to explain to each other within the government where that money went. So I'm hoping that has a big impact. But over and above that, a third independent party actually verifying that, I would absolutely welcome. So I think it's a great idea. And I think the more we can almost link private and public working together, the better for the country. That's my overall take on this.
And just leaning a bit into your area of expertise in terms of Forex, the Rand is strengthened. It's strengthened quite nicely and seems to be stabilizing around that 16 Rand to the dollar. Of course, that's also a bit of a mixed bag, because for the exporters, I suppose they don't want to see the Forex too strong, and they also don't want to see it too weak because of them importing parts and stuff like that. How do you see that? Is the Rand going to stabilize? Is it stabilized? Is it pegged now? We have seen a lot more stability than we have in the past, where this mad volatility with the Rand seems to have come down to a point where it's sitting okay. How do you see that going forward for the rest of the year?
Yeah, Greg, it's a great question, and a very interesting time to ask that question, because we've just come off the back of a mass strike by the US and Israel on Iran, and Iran retaliating to that. And so we're seeing a massive war having broken out. And so really what happened was this morning, the Rand actually opened up at closer to 16.1 and is currently at 16.17. So it's actually weakened below that 16 mark or above that 16 mark, weaker than the 16 mark. And the reason for that is actually completely out of our control. It's not South Africa's fault. It's just instability in the world. So we have to remember that, as well as we do within South Africa, there are external factors which we simply can't control. But what I'll say is that when the budget speech happened, the Rand traded in a band between 15.83 and 15.88. So within our borders, I think we're doing a pretty good job at stabilizing the Rand and hopefully bringing it down lower than the 16 mark. However, things like this, which are out of our control, can blow us all out of the water. If America coughs, South Africa gets a cold. We see that over and over and over again. And this is just the latest demonstrating that. And so I can't speak for what's going to happen globally and how secure we're going to be globally. But within our country, I do think the Rand is finally on the up, and I do suspect that we can strengthen further than where we are, assuming that everything in the world remains somewhat under control and that this war hopefully ends relatively soon. My suspicion is the 15.50 and even 15 to 1 mark are not out of the question for the end of the year, but it's dependent on not only what happens in our country, but also externally in America and the rest of the world.
And that's good news generally for our economy if it remains in that stable region, not strengthening too much, not weakening too much. But in terms of the individuals, what should they be doing? Should they be buying dollars, or should they be buying gold?
It's a great question, Greg. And my take overall is what you can't go wrong either buying gold or dollars, but where you can go wrong is over leveraging to the rand. As South Africans, we have a very, very strong affinity to say, I live in South Africa, so I'm going to therefore invest in rands. And it makes sense. This is what you see. This is what you know. This is what all the prices you see are in. The problem is that you're heavily exposed to a sharp weakening of the rand should something go wrong, either within the country or outside of the country. And so the way I see it is, even if you're the most optimistic, bullish person on the rand, feeling that the rand is going to come to 13, 12 to 1, it doesn't justify keeping all your money in South Africa because it's just risk mitigation at the end of the day. I'm an actuary, and so for me, I always look at things from a risk-centered point of view. So it feels natural to say, if you have enough wealth such that you save, a decent proportion of those savings should be offshore to ensure that you're globally wealthy, not just rand wealthy. And that way, if in a very, very unprecedented, terrible event, if the rand does what happened in Zimbabwe to the Zimbabwe dollar, you won't end up being globally poor because you've got a decent chunk of your money actually sitting abroad. And so I always preach that irrespective of your view on South Africa, I, for one, am very, very bullish on South Africa. I do believe that the rand is currently weaker than it should be. That hasn't stopped me from putting some of my wealth abroad, and I suspect the same is true for a lot of South Africans. Irrespective of how bullish you are in South Africa, I really think putting a decent proportion of your wealth into euros, pounds, dollars, or gold is a relatively safe choice.
And it's also an interesting bond market currently, and we've seen all sorts of things happening with the bonds and bonds shifting. South African bonds, I think the last issue was oversubscribed many, many times over. So there seems to be a large demand, interest from overseas in South African bonds. But there's also, as you mentioned, that thing that I want to keep things even in a portfolio. So even if you're buying relatively safe things such as bonds, you also wanting to actually just balance your investments with some overseas exposure. What kind of exposure would you say people need to be looking at as a percentage of their investment?
So this all depends on your quality of life and your cost of living versus what you spend versus what you save. But in my view, net of what you spend, in other words, what you have in your portfolio outside of what you spend, I would argue at least 50% of your exposure should be offshore based. That's my take. And this is over and above what you spend. So if you're planning on spending a certain amount in South Africa, take that out of the equation and say only what's over and above that. If you're lucky enough to have money over and above what you spend, 50% of that, I argue, should be offshore because it's just safer. And if you are someone who actually doesn't feel strongly about South Africa and the rand, you can put more than that. But if you feel bullish on the rand and you feel the rand has a long way to go, I'd say the maximum amount you want in rand terms over and above your spending capacity would be about 50% of your wealth.
That's fantastic. Any last thoughts? What's going to happen in the Forex market? What are the other highlights? I know the yuan's gone to its strongest level in quite a while the Indian currencies, the rupees, losing traction. All sorts of things happening with currencies. Any highlights you want to give to us as a last thought?
I can tell you that what we've seen from our clients who are typically importers, exporters, we've got a book of clients going out the country and into the country. The general consensus is that people are relatively optimistic about the rand. And what I mean by that is we're assisting people who bring money into the country take out forward exchange cover because they're scared that the rand's going to strengthen further and they're going to effectively lose out on their exchange rate. Whereas those sending money out the country are typically waiting because they think the rand's going to get better and it will cost them less rands per dollar. So that's the general consensus of the public. It also echoes my thinking, but regardless, none of us have a crystal ball, and we can't be sure which way the rand's going to go relative to major currencies. And so my take is that if you're a individual looking to hedge your rand risk, or if you're a business looking to make payments for imports, I'm always of the view that risk mitigation is better. And so some form of forward exchange cover is necessary if you know you're going to make a payment in the future, to lock in your pricing now, just so it doesn't move against you and effectively destroy your margin. So I can't know for sure. My take is that the rand should strengthen, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't, because none of us have a crystal ball. And so my best advice as someone in the space is to take out forward exchange cover. That's what we've advised most of our clients to do. And that in turn will allow for surety of pricing rather than taking unnecessary risks.
It's better to be sure of a level you have now than perhaps to take a wager on it improving in the future. So
Completely
great
agree.
advice there. And Harry, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your insights. And I hope we get to chat more regularly on No Free Lunch about some of the interesting things happen in the financial world.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. It's been great to be on, and please invite me back anytime. We'd love to chat.